Olivia Metcalf was a former member here at this church while she was in seminary, and now she is the district superintendent of the upstate New York district Church of the Nazarene. And last year, for some reason, my memory was jogged to remember something she posted last September, believe it or not. So my memory's not too far gone quite yet. But I remember something that she had reposted September 11th, 2018. And you'll recognize that date, of course, as the date of the terrorist attacks against the United States in 2001. She wrote this: "On this day, I remember wondering, on that day, September 11th, 2001, I remember wondering this: why would I bring a child into a world like this?" In the midst of all that was happening, Dustin, her husband, and she were at the seminary, and she was pregnant with their first child, Drew. And she asked that question on that day and the days that follow: how could I bring a child into this kind of world? She woke up that day to her alarm clock, but it wasn't the normal music that played. It was the news bulletin about the terrorist attacks. And they immediately turned on the TV to watch. And as they watched, they saw the second plane hit the second tower. Live, she said. And they began to call all their family members in other parts of the country. They weren't awake yet because they were living on Mountain or Pacific time. And they all began to watch together the events of that day that happened. All these people jumping out of the World Trade Center to their death, watching all those things and wondering, what kind of world am I going to bring this child into? I imagine that the exiles of Babylon are asking similar kinds of questions. Remember, they have been led off to captivity to a foreign land where everything's different. The language is different, the culture is different, the religious atmosphere is completely different. I can imagine them asking questions like, what sort of world are we going to be living in now that everything is different and that we've lost everything? With all these new surroundings that we are now experiencing with the new language and the culture, how are we supposed to live? How are we supposed to live as God's people? Are we still God's people in exile even? Might be a question.
It's a question they need to ask themselves.
That's what I'm saying. They're probably asking that question. And these are poignant questions for us as well. Because, at least for two reasons. First, the Bible tells us that we're sojourners and strangers on earth. In other words, we're foreigners and strangers on earth, Hebrews 11:3. Our citizenship is in heaven, Philippians 3:20. We, like Abraham, are looking for a city whose foundations and the architect of which and builder is God himself. But also for a second reason, as some suggest, and including one of our general superintendents, Scott Daniels, that the church in America is increasingly living in exile. Here's what he says: people who live in exile feel displaced, like resident aliens. They feel like people who have to live counterculturally. So if we are living in exile, how are we supposed to live as God's people in this world? We find our text in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 1 through 9. This is the word of the Lord. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests and the prophets and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried off into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiachin and the queen mother, the court officials, and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsman and the artisan, had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elisha, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. It said, here's what the letter to the exiles said: "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those who I carried off from exile, or into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number, don't decrease there. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Don't let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Don't listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. The word of the Lord. So now the exiles are in exile, okay? That was a warning before. They were asked to return to the Lord repeatedly, over and over and over again. They did not listen. They didn't turn from their persistent idolatry. And so now exile is their reality. And Jeremiah is writing a letter to them, at least to the first wave of exiles that were sent into captivity. That happened in 597, and history counts down to Jesus. So 597 and 587, later on, that's when the fall of Jerusalem and Judah happened. But this is written to those initial exiles sent into captivity, we're told. And this is what Jeremiah is concerned about and who he's writing to. According to 2 Kings 22, and as noted in verse 2, notice who's all part of this first wave of exiles. King Jehoiachin, who we got to know last week, his mother, and all the people in Jerusalem, including the nobles, his officials, and the soldiers, the fighting men, all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000 people are taken. And Jeremiah writes to them, and he wants to let them know that the Lord is saying, he wants to make it clear to them that this exile isn't going to be short-lived. They're going to be there a while. It's not going to be short-lived, as the false prophets are saying. If you turn to chapter 28, just before this, you'll see one of those false prophets, Hananiah, who said, it's only going to be short-lived. Don't worry about it. God's going to bring you back. He's going to break the yoke of the king of Babylon. You're going to only be there. Within 2 years, you're going to be back here, he says. Back home in Jerusalem. He says, King Jehoiachin's going to be back on the throne. All of you exiles are going to come back home, he says, within 2 years. And that sounds very appealing, doesn't it? Especially in contrast to what Jeremiah is saying in verse 10. It's going to be 70 years. You can see how the message of the false prophets, they would want to listen to that. Oh yeah, 2 years is much better. I'm going to listen to that. But you see, it was false hope. It wasn't true. And Jeremiah is clarifying for them that they are not going back home anytime soon. And that's apparent from the instructions that the Lord gives to these exiles in verses 4 through 9. Look at what he tells them to do. Build houses and settle down. The Message, or the New Living Translation, puts it, build homes and plan to stay. In other words, it's going to be longer than 2 years. He tells them to plant gardens and eat what they produce. And we know something about gardens. It takes a while to cultivate them. They just don't spring up and happen overnight, especially if you're starting from scratch. That is a long, laborious process that if you thought you were going to be gone in a few months or a few years, you probably would try to get by without doing all that hard work. But he's saying, no, do the hard work of planting and cultivating those gardens. That's what's going to help sustain you in these years of exile. Then he says, marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. The New Living Translation puts it, multiply, don't dwindle away in exile. And that raises Olivia's question in the aftermath of those terrorist attacks. You remember her question? Why would I bring a child into a world like this? I imagine the exiles having similar kinds of questions. They're told to start families in exile in a foreign land surrounded by everything completely different. Why would they want to bring a child into a world like that? under the oppression of Babylon. Why would they want to subject their children to that? Why would they want them to experience that heartache? Would it even be responsible to bring a child into that kind of world and that kind of circumstance? But did you hear the language used in God's command? Increase. It echoes God's creational intention for all of humanity, and that's the word of hope here. You remember that? Genesis 1:27-28. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the whole earth and subdue it." His message to the exiles picks up on and echoes God's creational intention for all of humanity. In other words, the chaos of their current circumstances does not subvert or circumvent God's creational intention. In fact, he's really announcing that this is part of the new beginning that he's giving to them. All the promises of restoration that he's going to bring to them, this is part of it. He's extending grace to his people, these exiled people. They are not to diminish, he says, or become extinct. Rather, if you remember the rest of the account of the history of God's people, the salvation history of God's people, what happened in Exodus? They increased and increased and increased. And he's saying, just in the same way as you did in Egypt, you increased and became a multitude of people, increase in exile too. He's extending his creational blessing to them. So the Lord has already promised, as we looked at in chapter 23, verse 3, he's already promised that when he brings them back, he's going to increase and multiply them. But he says, now, I want you, even in exile, live into that promise I've already given to you. It would be a way of saying, yes, I believe that's going to happen. It's a way of trusting God in what he says is true. In a sense, then, to have children and to start families is to anticipate and celebrate the promises of God in advance. And on this Father's Day, that's reason to assure families and parents that their families or their little societies can become expressions that speak to the world about God's creational intention and of his kingdom, even while they live in the chaos of this world, and we might say even exile. 17 years later, after 9/11, Olivia had an answer to her younger pregnant self to the question she asked that also is in line with what Jeremiah is saying, and that provides hope for us, whether we have children or not. She said, I have an answer to my younger self when I was asking that question. I didn't have the answer then, but I have it now. What kind of world would I bring this child into? Her answer was a broken one, a dark one filled with suffering, yes. And yet it is the world God is redeeming, the world that God loves. It is the world that Christ died for. It's the world where the Holy Spirit is using his people to partner with God in his kingdom work. She quotes the words of Jesus, take heart, I have overcome the world. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world, Jesus says. And she says, may the love of Christ then compel and propel us to live lives that give life even to those who have chosen to be our enemies. May we choose Jesus above all else. That's a good word to those living in exile or in the chaos of this world. The story behind the hymn, Because He Lives, provides another good word for us as we perhaps even live in exile in a way ourselves. You know the song, Because He Lives? Bill and Gloria Gaither are the authors of that song, and in an interview with them, they explain the meaning or the story behind the song. They wrote it in 1970. And Gloria explained, for a whole decade, the news and everything in the world was just nothing but chaos. For a whole decade. And she began to ask the same question that Olivia asked when she became pregnant with their third child, Benji. She says, how in the world can I bring a child into this mess and this chaos? What will happen when he has to face the world, when he gets older? Why would I bring a child into this kind of world? After her son was born, their son was born, she said that the theological things they said that they believed really finally began to dawn on them and to take hold in their hearts. You know, the circumstance and their beliefs came at a crossroads. Did they really believe what they said they believed? And here's what she said. And what she says and the realization she comes to applies to everyone, not just those with children. Here's what she said. You don't do what you do, get married and have kids because the world is stable. If you waited for that day, it ain't coming. And we could add to whatever we're giving ourselves to in the season of life that we're in. She was dealing with a new little one on the way, but whatever season of life that we're in, some of you are in retirement in that new season. Some of you are becoming grandparents or great-grandparents. Some of you are facing other difficulties or challenges. Whatever season of life you're in, we don't do what we do because the world is stable, she says. Listen to her answer. This applies to everyone. We don't do what we do because the world is stable. We do all of it because Christ is real and the resurrection is true. That's good stuff, by the way. Christ is real and the resurrection is true. Despite the instability of the world and all around us, if that's our individual lives or the nation, which is, by the way, chaotic, or the world, which, by the way, is chaotic, it's not stable. Our hope isn't in the stability of the world or our circumstances. Our hope is in the fact that Jesus is alive. Because he lives, and that became the basis of what is verse 2 in the song, Because He Lives. Do you know it? How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives, but greater still is the calm assurance that this child can face uncertain days because he lives. You see, that isn't just an Easter Sunday song. That is a song for today and tomorrow and everything else, and whatever uncertainty or chaos is or will be in the future. That truth speaks to it. Christ is real and the resurrection is true. Maybe you haven't hit the crossroads yet. Maybe you haven't hit the place where your mental assent to that, oh yeah, Christ is real. Yes, the resurrection is true. Have you come to the place where it hits the intersection of chaos and instability? It did for them. And they came to the place by the grace of God where they could say, because he lives, I can face tomorrow. So how do we live as God's people in exile? We live as those convinced that this world is being redeemed, that God is the God of beginnings and new beginnings, of creation and new creation, that God's creational intentions for the world are still good, including the family. That's his institution, marriage is as well. That is his good creational intention, that still stands. And then from 1 Peter read this morning, did you hear? He was addressing other exiles in the Roman Empire who were suffering oppression of their own, and the word that he gave to them. Did you hear it? It echoes the song that we're going to sing here in a little bit. He says that Jesus Christ is our living hope. That's the message he has for the exiles in the dispersion there, in the backwoods, as somebody's called it, of the Roman Empire. He's addressing all those places, Pontus, Bithynia, Cappadocia, all those places. And he says, listen, all of you who are scattered in all these places, Jesus is your living hope. Listen to what he says. By his great mercy, he has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Jesus is our living hope. There's so much more here in Jeremiah chapter 29, but I didn't want to come to that that wonderful statement and message and then taper off a little bit. So let's stay with that a little bit and see how we might respond to it. How do we live as God's people in exile? The families of God's people, these little societies, can be expressions of God's good intention for his creation and of his kingdom in the midst of the brokenness. I've already stated that. It doesn't mean that our families will or have to be perfect to bear that witness. But it means that God has established this institution in order to create a community of support and love that speaks God's love and grace and mercy to the world around us. That is completely different than the answer we would probably come up with. That's God's answer to the chaos of the world. The family. Remember what Scott Daniels said about those living in exile? They feel displaced. They feel like they have to live counterculturally. Here's how we can apply it. You know what would be countercultural? Is if families brought their children and grandchildren up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That would be countercultural. Alex Verghese says, shalom, that is wholeness, peace, does not come through violence and anti-government activities, but through building homes, establishing family, and engaging in the normal activities of life. That's how it happens. You know, Gloria Gaither, the musicians would come, who wrote Because He Lives, was thinking about her newborn baby. But I have learned from many of you that it doesn't matter how old your children get. If they're out of the house and start having children of their own, it doesn't matter how old they get. You still wonder about them. You still care about them. You still pray for them. You still wish they would call more and visit more. You still love them very much. So this morning, one of the ways we can respond is to, no matter how old our children are or not, is to trust the Lord with our family. In the bulletin this morning, I've given you a prayer calendar that I've been using on a regular basis to pray for our children or our grandchildren. And again, those apply to ourselves as well, but an intentional way to pray for our families and to trust them to the Lord. And then whether or not we have children or whether or not we're married, you know, we can still make that same investment in the children around us. Maybe it's other family members. Maybe it's the children of our own church. In fact, if you go out in the foyer, you can see the pictures of 12 or 13 of the kids that are part of our church. And you can take one of those prayer cards to pray for them. You can pray for them. And you can consider prayerfully giving to the curriculum that needs to be purchased as well. And whether we have kids or not, or whether we're married or not, this hope that he announces stands for everyone, every believer. We can face the uncertainty of the days we're living in, the chaos of this world. We can face all of that and whatever lies ahead because of the goodness and faithfulness of God, because Jesus lives and reigns forever. I like how Gloria put it, though. You remember how she put it? We don't do all that we do. We don't walk with the Lord. We don't serve him. We don't do whatever we do in our entire lives because the world is stable. We do it because Christ is real and the resurrection is true. I want to invite you to stand and let's sing that in affirmation, because he lives.